Imagine 40 consecutive days in which missiles and drones sweep across nearly every corner of Russian territory, not as posturing, not as a warning shot, but as a fully sanctioned, signed operational blueprint. On June 25th, 2026, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy took a step no wartime Ukrainian leader had taken before him, greenlighting what could be the most sweeping deep strike campaign the war has yet produced. A 6-week offensive engineered to pressure Vladimir Putin into finally sitting down at a negotiating table. The strikes didn't wait. Within hours of the announcement, explosions were already lighting up Russian skies. What follows is a breakdown of exactly what was authorized, why it matters so much, and what's actually unfolding on the ground since it began. After sitting down with Yevgeny Kamara, the acting head of Ukraine's security service, Zelenskyy took to social media to reveal he'd signed off on what he described as a 40-day campaign of pressure against the aggressor nation, intended to push it toward ending the war. Reporting from the Kyiv Independent indicates Kamara walked the president through Ukraine's long and medium-range strike planning, along with fresh operational results from the SBU's Alpha Special Forces unit. Zelenskyy offered no detailed war room map for public consumption, nor did he need to, because Russian air defense crews had already been experiencing the reality of this shift for weeks. The true center of gravity in this conflict has moved onto Russian soil itself. The clock on this operation runs from June 25th through roughly August 4th, and as we'll unpack later, that closing date is anything but arbitrary. There's a layer of meaning buried in that specific day that stretches back into Russian history itself. But first, let's look at the sheer scale of firepower Ukraine is bringing to bear. This isn't a single weapon system doing the work. It's a blended arsenal. There are long-range attack drones like the Lyuti and the Peklo, rocket-boosted platforms that sit somewhere between an ordinary drone and a genuine cruise missile. Western hardware is folded into the mix, too. Storm Shadow cruise missiles and ATACMS ballistic missiles among them. But the piece that has fundamentally altered the math of this war is homegrown. The FP-5 Flamingo, a domestically manufactured cruise missile capable of striking beyond 900 kilometers and delivering a warhead north of a metric ton. This isn't a weapon meant to harass or annoy, it's built to obliterate hardened, high-priority targets outright. Combine that with ground-launched cruise missiles, decoys built to mimic real threats and confuse radar operators, and slower attritional drones used purely to saturate defenses. And what you get is an environment where Russian airspace, from the capital down to occupied Crimea, effectively never goes quiet. The geographic reach of the plan is staggering to comprehend. To the north, target lines run straight through Moscow and St. Petersburg before pushing east into the Ural Mountains. To the south, Krasnodar, Volgograd, and occupied Crimea all sit squarely within reach. In theory, virtually every significant military, industrial, or logistical hub inside Russia is now exposed. And this wasn't left as theory for long. In the campaign's earliest days, Ukrainian forces alongside SBU Alpha operatives struck across 12 separate Russian regions almost simultaneously. 12 regions hit together. The epicenter, predictably, was Moscow. Russia's own defense ministry was forced to admit publicly that the country had just weathered one of the largest drone assaults in its history. 660 kamikaze drones launched in a coordinated, multi-angle wave designed to overload and blind the capital's radar network. A number of them punched straight through the layered defensive shield surrounding Moscow. The city's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, confirmed publicly just how serious the threat had become, as smoke and flame rose from the Moscow oil refinery, a site often described as the fuel lifeline of the entire capital region. That refinery hit wasn't chosen at random either. It was a deliberate effort to strangle the fuel supply feeding Russia's war effort, and later reporting shows just how successful that strategy turned out to be, something we'll return to shortly because it's one of the more overlooked storylines of this entire war. While smoke still hung over Moscow, a second theater opened up to the south in Tula Oblast, a region central to Russian industrial and chemical manufacturing. Long-range Ukrainian strikes knocked out energy infrastructure near Novomoskovsk and hit a chemical plant in the area. Factories lost power. Transmission lines were cut. The long-held assumption that Russia's interior offered some kind of safe zone, insulated production untouched by the front lines, began visibly falling apart. Further south still, in Krasnodar Krai, the Tukhovskaya oil depot erupted into a massive blaze following a precision drone strike. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a direct hit on the logistical backbone, supplying both the Black Sea Fleet and the Southern Front. And that single strike was only one thread in a much bigger campaign aimed at a singular goal: isolating occupied Crimea entirely. More than any other location, Crimea has become the focal point of this operation's violence. Drone strikes and special forces raids hit nearly every part of the peninsula. Two Russian support vessels, the Volga and the Vyatka, both essential to military logistics and undersea cable operations, were badly damaged and set ablaze. Air defense radar installations were knocked blind. Power infrastructure took enough damage to plunge large stretches of the peninsula into darkness. Facing a crisis they could no longer downplay, Moscow-installed occupation officials declared a regional state of emergency. Euronews reported that this declaration came just days after Ukrainian forces destroyed a railway bridge spanning the North Crimean Canal, along with fuel depots and military sites scattered across the region. Roughly half the peninsula reportedly lost power. Fuel sales were restricted, tourism was suspended, summer camps were shut down. This is a territory being methodically pushed into a state of siege. Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, didn't mince words, stating publicly that conditions were becoming unbearable for Russia's grip on Crimea and that its logistics were being severed piece by piece as the peninsula is cut off from the mainland. According to Zelenskyy, none of this is accidental. It's a deliberate strategy designed to force Moscow into an impossible choice between defending the capital or defending Crimea, weakening everything else caught in between. Now let's dig into the technology itself, because the equipment being used tells its own story about how far this war has evolved. Start with the Flamingo. Built entirely within Ukraine, capable of striking beyond 900 kilometers, carrying a warhead exceeding 1 ton, roughly 3 to 4 times heavier than the payloads typically found on Western cruise missiles already in Ukraine's inventory, and rolling straight off domestic production lines rather than waiting on foreign political approval. That independence matters enormously, because it means Kyiv no longer has to wait for Allied sign-off every time it wants to strike deep inside Russian territory. Then there are the rocket-assisted drones, platforms like the Peklo, which blur the boundary between a slow kamikaze drone and an actual cruise missile, flying faster and lower than earlier drone generations, which is precisely why Russian air defense has struggled to keep up. Add in older, simpler long-range drones used purely for volume and saturation, and you end up with a 3-layered assault: slow drones to exhaust and confuse air defense, fast jet-powered platforms to slip through the gaps that confusion creates, and heavy cruise missiles to finish the job once the path is cleared. Compare that with how Russian air defense was actually built. Systems like the S-400 and the Pantsir were designed for an earlier era of warfare, when the primary threats were fighter jets and large, fast-moving cruise or ballistic missiles with predictable radar signatures. They were never built to counter swarms of small, slow, low-altitude drones arriving by the hundreds. That mismatch explains a lot about how a single wave of 660 drones can still break through, even against hundreds of concentrated air defense batteries. Putin clearly understands the danger. In response, defenses around Moscow and the Valdai region, where his residence sits, were raised to their highest alert level, with hundreds of S-400 and Pantsir systems reportedly pulled off the front lines and redeployed into a dense protective shell around the capital. But concentrating your best defenses in one place creates a problem elsewhere. Everything else becomes vulnerable. Regions like Bashkortostan in the Urals, the refineries around Ufa, the industrial complexes near Samara, and missile component factories in Cheboksary all now sit well within Flamingo's striking range. and conventional Russian air defense, built to intercept larger, slower threats, struggles badly against drone swarms layered with decoys. That vulnerability was proven directly when Ukrainian forces hit the Titan Barricades military production plant in Volgograd, a facility tied to manufacturing Iskander and Yars missile systems. Watching that site burn sent an unmistakable message. Russia's capacity to build the weapons sustaining this war is no longer safe, no matter how deep inside the country it's located. This is the asymmetric heart of the strategy. Ukraine isn't trying to match Russia missile for missile or tank for tank. It's using decoys to draw out and drain Russian air defense, swarms to blind radar coverage, and a mix of slow and fast platforms to make nearly every corner of the country feel exposed, all at once, continuously, for 40 straight days. So why 40 days specifically, and why end right around August 4th? A few dates line up here in a way that feels far too deliberate to be coincidence. July 4th marks America's 250th anniversary, a moment when Western solidarity behind Ukraine will naturally be back in the spotlight, alongside expected NATO discussions in early July. August 2nd is Russian Airborne Forces Day, a date loaded with symbolic weight on the Russian military calendar, and striking hard around it lands as much a psychological blow as a physical one. But the real weight sits in the closing date itself. On August 4th, 1991, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev departed Moscow for his vacation dacha in Foros, Crimea, carrying with him a nearly finalized draft treaty that would have granted Soviet republics dramatically greater independence. Weeks later, on the evening of August 18th, while he was away, a group of hardline officials moved against him, demanding he declare emergency rule or step down. He refused. He was placed under house arrest at his own retreat, his communications severed, and the briefcase containing Soviet nuclear launch codes taken from him. The next morning, the plotters announced they had seized control of the government. Tanks rolled into Moscow's streets. State television looped Swan Lake for hours, a broadcasting pattern Russians to this day instinctively associate with a government collapsing. The coup lasted only 3 days, undone by a fatal miscalculation that soldiers would simply follow orders without question. Troops refused to fire on civilians. Some tank crews defected outright. Boris Yeltsin climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building and rallied tens of thousands to resist. By August 22nd, it was over. Gorbachev was released, but his political authority never recovered. The Communist Party was banned that November, and by December, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist entirely. In modern Russian memory, August 4th is remembered as the spark that eventually brought down an empire. And underneath that layer sits another one. That collapse traces back to Crimea, the very territory Putin annexed in 2014, and the very territory now sitting at the heart of this 40-day campaign. Whether Kiev is deliberately invoking that symbolism or not, it wouldn't be lost on anyone in the Russian elite, familiar with their own history. The implicit message is simple. History has an uncomfortable habit of repeating itself. That psychological pressure operating on a level most viewers never even register. Now, to the question of whether any of this is actually working, and here it's important to separate confirmed fact from claim. Zelenskyy has referenced internal Russian documents reportedly obtained by Ukrainian intelligence, claiming public anxiety inside Russia has climbed past levels seen even during Ukraine's incursion into Kursk last year, with the same figures suggesting 66% of Russians now describe their financial situation as difficult, and more than 80% believe a major economic crisis is now unavoidable. Those numbers deserve real skepticism. They originate from Ukrainian intelligence in the middle of an active war and have not been independently verified, and morale claims about an adversary are, by nature, part of the broader information war. Still, what's genuinely notable is that verifiable, independent economic data lines up with a similar trajectory. Russia's economy contracted in the first quarter of 2026. Oil and gas revenue, the primary funding source for the war, fell nearly 50% in the year's opening 2 months, hitting a 5-year low. The National Welfare Fund, often called the Kremlin's emergency reserve, is being drawn down at a rapid pace. Inflation remains in double digits. interest rates sit near 16.5%, and new tax hikes took effect in January. Even Putin himself has acknowledged publicly that the economy is under real strain, and the fuel crisis specifically has only deepened since the operation was announced. Reporting from Radio Free Europe indicates that as of late June, at least 55 of Russia's 83 federal regions were enforcing mandatory or company-imposed fuel restrictions, the worst nationwide shortage seen in years. The Moscow Times reported that the Kapotnya refinery, the single largest fuel supplier for the Moscow region, was struck twice within weeks and is expected to stay offline through at least the end of 2026. The independent outlet Mediazona mapped fuel rationing across 56 regions, with the harshest restrictions concentrated in occupied Crimea and Sevastopol, where public fuel sales have effectively stopped altogether. United 24. Media reports that more than 20 refinery strikes since the start of the year have knocked out roughly a quarter of Russia's total refining capacity, with gasoline output down about 25% compared to the same period last year. Russia has reportedly begun importing gasoline by sea for the first time in years and is negotiating emergency fuel purchases from Kazakhstan. In oil-rich regions like Khanty-Mansiysk, residents have pointed out a bizarre contradiction. Wells being shut down for lack of storage space, while ordinary people can't find gasoline at local pumps. A complaint that came not from Kiev, but from a Russian citizen quoted in an independent Russian outlet describing the absurdity unfolding in his own country. The restrictions paint an increasingly strange picture of a nation at odds with its own infrastructure. In Tiva, a remote region without a functioning railway, gasoline prices have surged past 90 rubles a liter, the highest anywhere in the country, since every drop of fuel now has to arrive by truck or plane. In the Kursk region, residents near the Ukrainian border say rationing has made it nearly impossible to run generators during the very air raids that knock out power in the first place. In Tatarstan, home to Russia's fifth largest oil producer, rationing followed directly from a Ukrainian strike on the flagship Tanaco refinery in Nizhnekamsk. And in regions as far away as Siberia, Novosibirsk and Omsk among them, more than 2,500 kilometers from the front line, governors have had to announce their own fuel restrictions publicly on Telegram. Estimates from Energy Intelligence, cited by the Belarusian outlet Charter 97, place Russian oil refining volume below 4 million barrels a day in early June, the lowest level in 21 years, with nearly a third of the country's total refining capacity sitting idle. Russia's response has included emergency measures rarely seen since the Soviet era. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak has floated the idea of a full ban on diesel exports. Belarus, meanwhile, has ramped up emergency fuel shipments to its ally, with gasoline deliveries up 11% and diesel shipments up 23% in May alone. None of that reflects a country calmly absorbing pressure. It reflects a government rationing its way through a self-inflicted energy crisis in the middle of a war it insists it's winning. So even if Zelensky's precise morale statistics can't be independently confirmed, the broader picture of an economy under sustained structural strain aligns closely with what multiple independent sources are reporting on their own. The military dimension of this pressure campaign is even harder to argue with, because the clearest evidence comes directly from Russia's own defense ministry. In May 2026, the ministry reported shooting down 8,849 drones. Back in January, that monthly figure sat at 3,676. In just a few months, the scale of the drone threat facing Russia has roughly 2.5 times over. At the same time, some analysts have noted that overall Russian missile and drone strikes against Ukraine have occasionally dipped in recent weeks, a trend most military analysts interpret not as weakness, but as stockpiling ahead of a larger retaliatory wave. That's the two-way nature of this moment. Even as Ukraine escalates its pressure campaign, Russia may quietly be loading up its next counterpunch. So will 40 days actually be enough to force Putin toward negotiations? There are legitimate arguments on both sides, and both deserve honest treatment. The skeptical case starts with resilience. Russia's economy has weathered sustained pressure for more than 4 years without collapsing. Independent surveys have shown relatively high life satisfaction among ordinary Russians in recent years, suggesting society has adapted to wartime conditions more successfully than many predicted. Oil and gas revenue, while sharply reduced, still represents only part of the federal budget, meaning sanctions alone are unlikely to bring the state to its knees. External events can also work in Russia's favor. Periods of heightened tension in the Middle East, for instance, have previously driven oil prices upward and handed Moscow sudden fiscal breathing room. The more concrete risk is retaliation. Intense pressure campaigns rarely go unanswered, and a temporary dip in Russian strike activity could simply be the calm before a much larger wave aimed at Ukraine's own power grid and cities. Russia isn't operating alone either. Drone components and broader technology transfers from China, along with ammunition and manpower support from North Korea, are helping Moscow absorb pressure that would otherwise hit far harder. The Kremlin has consistently brushed off negotiation overtures and clung tightly to its public narrative of inevitable victory. Realistically, expecting 6 weeks of strikes to suddenly bring Putin to the table is, at best, an optimistic outlook, and there's a genuine possibility the Kremlin simply spins this domestic anxiety as Western provocation, using it to stir nationalist sentiment rather than soften its stance. But there's another side to weigh. Even if this specific 40-day window doesn't deliver an immediate breakthrough, it isn't happening in isolation. It's an intensified chapter within a much longer pressure campaign that's been building for months, arguably since refinery strikes accelerated through the back half of last year. Refinery damage isn't being repaired nearly as quickly as it's being inflicted. The welfare fund keeps shrinking. Every additional strike adds incremental weight onto a structure already straining under inflation, elevated interest rates, and a shrinking economy. The bigger risk, honestly, may sit on Ukraine's own side of the ledger. Maintaining an operation at this intensity for 40 consecutive days places enormous strain not just on Russia, but on Ukraine's drone production lines, its intelligence infrastructure, and the patience of its Western allies. There's one more wrinkle worth noting. Reporting from the Kiev Independent cites a senior Ukrainian official saying that U.S. President Donald Trump had privately encouraged Zelenskyy to act more aggressively against Russia, suggesting Washington's tolerance for this kind of pressure campaign may currently be higher than at earlier points in the war. That dynamic alone could shape how sustainable this operation proves to be across its full 6-week run. Ultimately, success here hinges on 3 things aligning at once. International backing has to hold firm. Internal unrest inside Russia has to keep intensifying rather than plateauing. And Ukraine has to physically sustain this tempo of long-range strikes for the entire duration without depleting its resources faster than it can rebuild them. That's the real story sitting underneath this week's headlines. Not one dramatic strike, but a coordinated, calculated 6-week campaign built to hit Russia's military, its economy, and its psychology all at once, timed, whether by design or coincidence, to close on one of the most symbolically charged dates in modern Russian history.